I thought I would take the liberty to talk to you on the development experience of Kerala, some strategic choices for the future. This is something which anybody can come and make the kind of pronouncements and walk away with. There is a tradition of debating this question of a model of development. And that debate on a Kerala model of development, that was initiated with the work done at the Center for Development Studies early in the 1970s. We have Mrudu Leepan, we have also colleagues who certainly participated in that venture. And that collective effort, led by Professor Raj, K.N. Raj, the tallest figure in the academia. I mean, I have come across in the Indian economics domain. I mean, now we have eminent people, but then at a time when economics was the leading, I mean, the most talked about discipline in India, I mean, it was Professor K.N. Raj who really stood at the frontiers, gave it direction. And then this work was led by the team of economists under the leadership of Professor K.N. Raj. And that culminated in the preparation of a volume, Poverty, Unemployment, and Development Policy. The volume served as a platform to sound out innovative ideas. Its central theme was that human development is not necessarily linked to high levels of income or high rates of economic growth. And that theme found resonance in many developing countries. And that prompted debate on the importance of public policy interventions. The volume focused on not on the uniqueness of Kerala, as we mistakenly believe that it was all about Kerala as a special case, and then trying to project it as the kind of a model to be emulated. On the contrary, it did not focus on the uniqueness of Kerala. But it certainly dwelt on the thresholds and preconditions to be fulfilled before public policy interventions can come to the fore. The focus was on public policy interventions. It required a whole sequence of developments, and that's what the study focused on. There were endogenous developments and some extraneous factors that profoundly influenced the course of events in Kerala. And that's where a lot of people have come together and listed the kind of sequence of events. Historians, sociologists, economists, they all put their heads together and came up with a number of interesting observations. First and foremost, the ascent of a larger geographical, geopolitical entity, the princely state of Travancore, from 1718 onwards, culminating in the establishment of a larger princely state by 1732. This happened way back in the 18th century. This was important because it's a significant departure from the kind of structure that we were used to. Kerala, you might know, is dotted with the kind of tiny principalities, self-contained feudatory chieftaincies, spread right from north to the south, nurtured by the river systems, independent of each other. These had extremely important implications. That led to these self-contained republics, who were not necessarily conquerable by the neighboring chieftaincies. So much so, from the 10th century onwards, that's the last time people talked about a bigger kingdom the Chera Empire. People talk about it. I mean, they also dispute its presence, but that's a different story. The point is that we continued as the kind of chieftaincies, an amalgam of chieftaincies for nearly 1,000 years. And it's at that stage, at the beginning of the early 18th century, that the larger geographical, political entity was carved out by one of those extremely adventurous kings from the south of Kerala, King Martandavarma. Historical interest. Then, that had a lot of sequential developments. Then it was followed by the early arrival of tenancy reforms. Things which happened in Russia, 1832, I mean, the kind of liberation of the peasantry, that kind of things people talk about in the 19th century context. But here was a feudal chieftain who was ascended to power and found it was extremely important to cut at the roots of his rivals. And that he did by liberating the peasantry. It was a major development. I mean, it's kind of the far-reaching consequences to the history of Kerala. All these things have been beautifully, elegantly narrated by one of the pioneers who did outstanding research in this field, Dr. T.C. Verghese, who did the work study in Delhi University under the supervision of Professor K. Raj. One of those beautiful books on Kerala agrarian history was written by T.C. Verghese. Its name is Agrarian Change and Economic Consequences. Those of you who get a chance should certainly go through this volume. What followed was the breakup of the feudal society, because once the root of their economic power was cut off, gradually the feudal society started disintegrating. And then, more importantly, that was the time the earliest strands of globalization was there up in the air. The advent of colonial powers looking for markets. And all these things cumulatively impacted on the spread of commercial agriculture. A peasantry liberated from the obligations to pay rents to their feudal chieftains started investing their surplus, first on themselves, in improving their level of living, going in for education, going in for healthcare, expanding their territories of cultivation, going in for commercial agriculture. All these things happened nearly in sequence. Then came the major demographic changes of the early 20th century, when people started going in for better quality healthcare. The spread of a primary health system spread over the entire length and breadth of Travancore, also spread into Cochin, which was beginning to emanate, but certainly not there in Malabar. These things had tremendous impact on the fertility levels in Travancore, the kind of demographic boom which started materializing sometime around the 1920s. All this led to a rise in population density, migration of people to the less densely populated regions, to the high ranges, to the northern parts of Kerala. They all started taking place, say, from the 1920s onwards. And that also happened to be a time when there was the emergence of an industrial proletariat in Kerala. That's the time we started focusing on traditional industries. The region was known for commercial produce, but then processing them, turning them, sending them for the bigger markets of the world started developing in Kerala. The earliest ascent of coir industry, textile industry, tile industry, cashew industry, all these things happened in the early part of the 20th century. There was also an extremely important development. The plantations came into being. Again, the advent of capital, the kind of know-how involved in cultivating commercial crops, having large tracts of land in the tropical belt, ostensibly with the help of European capital. All this led to making a phenomenal change in the structure of the economy, we started moving into a reasonably higher standard of living, say from the early part of the 20th century onwards. If you look into the kind of works by, let me say, Nagamaya, the early Travancore state manual, you know, he presents the kind of a glowing picture of an economy which is just poised to take off. Then subsequently it collapsed. I mean, that's something which historians need to look into. But then the fact of the matter is, there was a lot of hope in the air. There was a lot of expectancy in the air, and things were certainly looking for the better. And then the presence of an industrial proletariat in sizable numbers in major producing towns, notably Alleppey, they all had cumulative impact on the ascent of a left-wing political movement. They came defending the interests of the workers in these factory towns. And then came independence. The advent of independence also meant, inadvertently though, I mean, you know, which a lot of our policy makers, now it looks as though they subsequently regret it. It came with constitutional backing given to trade unions and to the exercise of procedural rights. This was a major departure. Every other country which experimented with democracy started with conferring, started with improving the material basket, which led to enhancement of the political space, which led to assertion of human rights, which led to demanding democratic arrangements. Here we started the experiment, not necessarily in a reverse way, but certainly giving preeminence to procedural rights being given prominence in our constitution. And that, you should understand, was part of a pact between the national leadership of that time with the trade union leadership of India in the major textile towns, in the major producing cities, in all those urban centers where trade unions were extremely prominent. That alliance between the national movement, the freedom movement, and the labor movement certainly culminated in giving procedural rights, civil liberties, a lasting place in the new Constitution of India drafted in the 1940s. And this had tremendous implication on subsequent development. Looking back, now when we say that all these labor laws, all these freedoms we confer to workers are irrelevant, we should have some kind of an exit clause, we should somehow make it possible to move out of the stranglehold of unions who are penalizing the public. So the public argument goes. But one should understand that there was a pact, an implicit social contract between the national leadership and the leadership of the trade union movement at that time. They did it in good faith, and that had far-reaching consequences on the making of a sane polity which we are now the proud repositories of. Now, cumulative impact of all these developments were manifested, but then there was something also happened. The 1930s depression that preceded independence also led to a long-term decline of the traditional industries of Kerala. The markets did not expand. And in the absence of expanding markets, there was a kind of wilting, there was a kind of stagnation of these industries. And the demography boom was taking place in Kerala. All this very seriously affected the labor-intensive industries of Kerala. The decline of the labor-intensive industries did take place, which compelled the national, the state political leadership, often with a pronounced leftward bias, to take on a redistributive transfers as a means of dealing with the situation. When people lost their jobs, when they found that their centers of work were being obliterated, when redistributive spending that gained ascendancy came, let me also say, something very profound happened in 1957, when following the linguistic reorganization of Kenya, the first general elections came, and the Communist Party came to power. And there was a pronounced emphasis in support of the cause of left, promoting the cause of work on redistributive transfers in support of the people who were cornered in that transformation process. Cumulative impact of all these changes were manifested in improved indicators of a physical quality of living and human development in Kerala. At a time when the rest of India was complaining about the kind of huge population growth, stagnation in the economy, famines in Bihar, we had the kind of strange situation. We were able to garner resources and spend substantially on improved educational facilities, improved healthcare, all these on behalf of the people who found that their traditional employment opportunities were being circumscribed. And that was entirely the result of a left-leaning polity taking important decisions in support of the people. And that led to these improved indicators of living. You should know that this is a staple of all researchers on comparative analysis. People talk about literacy rates, near universal access to primary education, declining rates of mortality, fertility, morbidity, higher levels of household consumption. All these eventually manifested because once we reached the threshold of declining fertility rate, there onwards a lot of doors were opened. People suddenly belonged to smaller families, the nucleus families, and they could afford to send their children to better education. The presence of a benevolent state extending help necessarily meant that all, irrespective of the class status, could make use of these facilities for improved educational opportunities. That led to them being stationed on value chains, on vantage points on value chains in the global market and earning returns based on their educational progress. They acquired the kind of strange mobility. All those girls who moved into nursing profession, all those young bright guys who moved into teaching profession all over the world. This was by far the outcome of a tremendous surge in education, preceded by the kind of health care reforms that reduced the fertility rates, made it possible for people to move out of the precincts of their house because taking care of the siblings was no longer an obligation. The youngster, especially young women, they could move out of the precincts of the house, look for a job because the kind of maintenance of the species related jobs were not there anymore. They were liberated from the precincts of the household, and which made it possible for a lot of people to enter the world market, position themselves at vantage points. The global value chains came into being. And coincidentally, Kerala also maintained very impressive levels with regard to social spending. We were at the top of the league tables when it came to expenditure on healthcare and education and all these things put together. The kind of a break, I mean the position which the state occupied, top position until, let me say, 2003, when an important piece of legislation came into being, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. That really circumscribed the powers of the state to go in for expansionary public spending. That put a stopper on our ability to indulge in redistributive transfers, improve the quality of education, reduce the size of the classrooms, make them move to more diversified skill formations, improve the quality of the public health system. All these things were urgently required. One way or the other, the state failed to move along those lines because of the stipulations made by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That's something which has got to be, in any case, reinstating social spending to its rightful place in history is an important challenge which needs to be taken up by the state's leadership in the years to come. And then I also drew your attention to the fact that the redistributive spending set the stage for a broad-based development, empowering people in the world of work to convert their economic space into a political space. I mean, by the way, this was the model which was followed in India. It was sort of strikingly different from what you call the social democratic model, wherein the kind of empowerment came much later. Here, through strengthening their entitlements, here we try to build on their civil liberties and that enable them. So all this turmoil we witness on the industrial relations front is certainly the outcome of that distinctly different path India took. And I still believe we should be proud of that, and we should try to strengthen it, because that, if ever there in the process we have created a humane society, it's because we tried to put emphasis on civil liberties and procedural rights of all people. But then in Kerala, something again remarkable happened. Because of the fact that there were far too many people who were cornered in this transformative process, the state stepped in, creating special institutional safeguards. There were minimum wage advisory boards, industrial relations committees, and thirdly, welfare fund boards. Three distinct sets of organizational umbrellas which really safeguarded the wages, working conditions, and social security needs, interests. I wouldn't say needs, interests of all these people, because what we tried to provide was certainly not very ambitious. That was all limited by the availability of resources. And there was not much to distribute, but nonetheless, there was a conscious effort made to improve the content of services provided to workers at the lower end of the skill hierarchy. More importantly, we tried to set up the kind of minimum wage advisory board, obviously following a central legislation, but then we tried to create the kind of wage boards in 78 domains of employment, almost accounting for something like 90% of the total population of the state, total population of the total employed population of the state, affecting their wages. That was done in a thoroughly democratic process, through a democratic process. Members, trade unions were promptly represented, the employer community too, and they deliberated, decided on minimum wages to be followed in almost every trade. And this was modified every third or fifth year, and with the kind of periodic updating of wages linked to consumer price index numbers. Nonetheless, it was a functional system. It was taken seriously by the trade union community, the labor community, the media, and certainly it was responsible for the kind of consistent increase in the real earnings of people across the board. Like that, we had also the industrial relations committees in all these places where we had serious problems dealing with labor relations. There again, a preemptive attempt to anticipate crisis and work out solutions. We had a kind of formal structure which was created actually way back in 1942. It was continued, and in the process we created that kind of industrial relations committees in something like 14 sectors, wherein wages, working conditions are being deliberated through the interaction of the tripartite community. Perhaps the most important one, which has far-reaching consequences, are the welfare boards. Something like 28 welfare fund boards were created. for all those jobs which were falling out of fashion, all those traditional crafts which were not sustainable, because inevitably in the process of change, the kind of jobs become obsolete. They move on to better trades and occupational categories, but then there will always be losers who fail to adapt themselves, and it's extremely important to take care of all those people who tend to fall on the wayside. They do not require the kind of wherewithal to move with the times, and it was precisely with this objective that the welfare funds were created. And in Kerala, by the way, we had a membership of something like 70 lakhs of members under the umbrella of 7 million workers out of, let me say, 14 or 15 altogether in the state who were members of the welfare funds, expecting the kind of benefits which they promised. And the fact of the matter is, we could not provide the kind of serious benefits to all these people. And this is something, again, one has got to give a lot of thought to. What's the right approach we should take? What's the kind of improvisation we should bring about? And what are the kind of benefits packages that one should think in terms of providing to people who put their faith, became members, made contributions, but at the end of it, they are going to find themselves at the receiving end, in the sense, very unequal relations receiving end, for the simple reason we haven't got the kind of wherewithal, we haven't mobilized the kind of required resources that can meet their legitimate aspirations. Therefore, when it comes to challenges ahead, one should think in terms of 2 or 3 things. One, we very proudly talk about minimum wages. Minimum wages, the way we have designed them, are all centered around subsistence wages. Actually, in the rest of the world, in many places, they're still centered around subsistence wages. But at crucial stages in the growth of nations, they moved from subsistence wages to the notion of fair wages. Wages you feel that is being true to, honest to you, and reward you for the kind of inputs you make. Wages which you think is not anybody's mercy to you. Wages you think is just reward for your skills and your efforts. And that kind of wage can be derived through what is called the fair wage system. Again, it's something which the entire tripartite community of the state, they've got to come together and work out the mechanics for allocating, for deciding on the content of fair wages. I'm not trying to say that it's going to promise the moon, but certainly where you feel that from the point you enter into the labor market, justice is being served to you, fairness is being served to you. That's in conformity with the notions of justice. The theory of justice says that from now onwards, I get fair returns. And that is fair wages all about. It's not subsistence wages decided around the calorific needs of people. One should be able to think outside the box and create an inclusive framework where fair wages are accessible to all in the labor force. Again, this is a major challenge which has got to be thought through, and this is where the polity has got to give greater attention. Still more important, and this is the point which I wish to spend another 5 minutes and I'll be through. This is about creating the right institutions for social protection. Because we talk about it at length, even in the union budget of this year, they talk about extending social protection without any promise about who pays for it. The point is, when somebody is promised 100,000 rupees worth of health care, it requires a certain cost. And that cost has got to be paid and one has got to work out arrangements for that. If we are going to treat the entire citizens as poor, who need to be subsidized, that's a different issue. But actually that's not the situation. This is where the state and the partners and all of us have got to come together and work out reasonable modalities for meeting the aspirations of people. Far more important is, everyone comes to the world of work with the intention of getting a secure income during work and also during the period they cease to work. There will still be the long life without disability, certainly extending well over 25 years as per latest health estimates, and people need a reasonable income to live through that period, which means one way or the other, we have got to strengthen the pension entitlements of people in their post-retirement life. And that pension entitlement, let's not delude ourselves into believing is going to be the gift of the state. We have got to make sure that every employee has at least 3/4 of the last derived salary coming to him as the pension entitlement, which means we have got to make sure that one way or the other, the annuities are built up over the working life of individuals, which in turn could be phased out to meet the pension requirements. Likewise, the parallel thing, the healthcare, which means Kerala has got to build on these two crucial and one important foundation, the existing health infrastructure. Actually, it's the most precious legacy of the past that we have a very well distributed healthcare structure all over Kerala. And without surrendering that, without letting it become obsolete through the onslaught of private sector forces, what is needed is to strengthen that at every stage, to make it possible for the public health system to compete on equal terms with the private sector, which requires massive state support. I wouldn't say subsidy. The state support through the right insurance institutions have got to be created. Make it possible for all the public sector hospitals to claim remuneration, reward, the insurance payment for the services they contribute to every patient, which means every patient has got to be brought under the social insurance scheme. The social insurance scheme, we certainly come across two categories: people who cannot pay for their premium and people who can certainly afford to pay their premium. But then those of them who can afford to pay, say, their premium, let's also be very clear. We are not, underline not, expecting the workers to contribute their premium. It's a fair maxim followed in all civilized societies that whenever, wherever a person is employed, his employer pays for the health expenses and for his pension expenses. That's all over the world. There's no reason why we should run away from that, saying that no, this is India, we are different. We are not. We cannot afford to be different. Every person by birth, by citizenship, is entitled to that kind of protection from the state to make sure that the kind of right endowments are built on behalf of every member of the working community to have the kind of annuities created towards the time of his retirement so that they can be contented citizens who can live their lives for having contributed to the creation of income and wealth right through their working lives. Which means essentially we should think in terms of building the kind of right institutional framework for doing that, which means certain rudimentary structures have got to be created in the state. Again, the public authorities have got to come to the fore, creating that kind of institutional framework. I'll just list a few of them. A state-level regulatory authority with a mandate to oversee the mobilization and distribution of funds for assistance as well as insurance. Let me say, Assistance meaning those of them who cannot afford to pay. There are people, losers in this game. All those people who cannot work, who cannot have their skills upgraded, who certainly belong to the lowest end of the skill spectrum, we don't expect them to contribute. On their behalf, the contributions will have to be made by the state. But then a state-level regulatory authority will have to be created, entrusted with the task of mobilizing resources, identifying them, and mobilizing resources. Second, the public health, which I already mentioned, the public health system of the state to be strengthened, to compete with the private sector on equal terms. Third, the basic administrative unit of a welfare office to be created at the local self-government institution, be it a panchayat or a municipality or a corporation. That welfare office has got to maintain digitized records of all potential beneficiaries of social assistance and social insurance, meaning healthcare and pension benefits, if they belong to the world of work, which means that kind of record keeping has got to become the established function of the state under the aegis of the self-government, local self-government institutions. Fourth, the crucial role of social actors, voluntary teams, even paid teams, drawn from the groups of beneficiaries, ought to become part of the light brigade. They should be there, taking membership, making collections, ensuring that the rewards are paid to them, and all those things will have to be overseen by a responsible group of people drawn from agencies who represent the interests of the workers. And these organizations have got to be manned by, have got to be supervised by the representatives of workers' organizations. That's one lesson we learned from the social democratic countries of Europe, that the welfare funds, the pension funds, the healthcare funds, they are all managed by workers' organizations, with of course representation by the state and perhaps with the employers' organizations. But nonetheless, these are managed, and that's one way of ensuring the loyalty, support, and goodwill of the entire community of workers. And that's something which ought to be borne in mind. And then the preconditions wise, there's one more thing. All entitlements of individuals in connection with their pension entitlements, in connection with the healthcare entitlements, need to be linked to their national identity cards, and they should be made portable across the country, irrespective of the duration of work, location of work. And that's where we become part of a national health insurance system. But it ought to start with the state in Kerala, where we make major breakthroughs by creating special institutional guards. Creating such institutional safeguards is eminently doable. What we need to have is the kind of goodwill to come together and work out the details. And I still believe that is there in the air, and it's distinctly possible by the signals that we receive from the polity right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jules, for a very rich paper. I think the discussion on this paper and discussion on the shorter presentation which are going to follow can all be done at one go, because all of them are dealing with Kerala's development experience. So without further ado, I would now call Dr. A.P. Sreeraj, Department of Economics, Central University of Rajasthan, who will give a paper on Kerala's growth experience in the post-1990s period, about 15 minutes.
Respected Chair, Professor Patnaik, and my dear friends. Here, Professor A.B. Jose beautifully described the development experience 2018. So I will be concentrating on what is happening in Kerala during the recent past. So my presentation is entitled as Kerala's growth experience in post-1990s radical departure from the 1980s a question mark. So the main objectives of my presentation is to understand the trend and pattern of economic growth, the causal structures of economic growth, and I will be deploying the aggregate demand analysis to understand the causal structures of economic growth. And we all know that private consumption expenditure is the largest component of aggregate demand. So I will be looking at the changes in consumption structure as well. So here is the methodology. To periodize the NSDP growth, I used biparent multiple structural analysis. And as I mentioned just while ago, I used aggregate demand analysis to understand the causal structures of growth following course and who. Breakpoint analysis, it is turned out that there are two breakpoints in 1971, 72 and 1987, 80. So we have three growth regimes from 1960, 61 to 1971, 72 and 1971, 72 to 1987, 88 and 1981, 87, 88 to 2009, 10. So here we can see that in the first growth regime we had a balanced growth. All sectors grew in tandem. In the second period, we can see that the primary sector experienced a negative growth and tertiary and secondary sector experienced a low growth. And in the last period, we can see that all the sectors experienced a substantial growth. From the sector-wise contribution to NSDP, we can see that Kerala experienced a drastic changes in drastic structural changes. We can see that the primary sector experienced a secular reduction in its contribution to overall NSDP. The secondary sector's contribution has increased over the years, and the tertiary sector's contribution experienced a radical improvement. It is very well known that the aggregate data at sub-national level is very difficult to come by. So here I piece together different data sets to create aggregate demand function. So I used here the NSSO unit record data to understand the consumption, changes in consumption expenditure. So here we can see that during 1983 to 1987, the urban consumption expenditure experienced a decline, and the rural consumption expenditure also experienced a decline, but the total consumption expenditure experienced an improvement. And in the second period, we can see that there is a drastic increase in consumption expenditure, both urban and rural, and so the total consumption expenditure. So here, to understand the trends in investment, I used data on investment in the factory sector and small scale industry sector. So here we can see that in factory sector and small scale industry sector, the investment in fixed capital has increased over the years. And in agriculture sector also, there is a rapid increase in investment. So in 1987, the total loan to agriculture was rupees 3,795 per hectare of gross crop area. It increased to rupees 7,666 in 2001-2, and in 2009-10 it increased to rupees 9,039.
Current or constant price?
Constant prices. Constant prices. So there are a lot of case studies on Kerala about the diversion of agriculture loans to other purposes. But we can see that the diversion is very less pronounced in Kerala compared to other Indian states. So here I looked at the government expenditure as a percentage of NSDP. Here we can see that in 1985 the total government expenditure as a percentage of NSDP is 21.73, and in 2004-10 it declines to 16.25. So there is a drastic reduction in government expenditure as a percentage of NSDP. So to understand, these are the important crops that Kerala export to other rest of India and other part, rest of the world. So here we can see that import as a proportion of to production in India is declining over the years. So the export trend also is also experiencing a reduction. So this is because in 1999, Government of India signed a treaty, ASEAN treaty, and Indo-ASEAN treaty and Indo-Sri Lankan treaty. So because of that, we experience a drastic reduction in export of these commodities. So here we can, here I am going to look at the structure of private consumption expenditure. So here I used class categories following Vagula Varna based on conscious category. So here these are the class group which I used for Kerala: elite, small farmers, non-agriculture workers, agriculture workers. So the first one is population percentage, and the second one is consumption percentage as a each class consumption as a proportion to overall consumption expenditure. So, and the third one is ratio. Ratio means each class MPC over total MPC. So here we can see that elite consumption contribution to overall consumption has increased in recent years, and the workers and agriculture workers and non-agricultural workers has declined in recent time, declined drastically in recent years. So here I used the ratio growth to understand how each class benefited in the growth process. So we can see that elite experienced a drastic improvement in the growth process compared to small farmers, non-agriculture workers and agriculture workers. So these are the conclusions from the above discussion. We can see that the growth is guided by the increase in consumption expenditure and the increase in investment. And we can also see that the consumption structure is elite based, as major chunk of total consumption expenditure is contributed by the elite, and the working class contribution has declined drastically. So this is because in recent years there has been a decline in social overhead expenditure by the state, and there has been an enrichment of rich class in recent years.
For that, I'd like to call Subin Dennis. What speak about emerging challenges to cellular development. Subin, 15 minutes.
25 years ago, the January 1991 issue of the renowned Marxist periodical Monthly Review had chosen Kerala as its focus. The lead article, or the review of the month, as Monthly Review calls it, was authored by Richard Franke and Barbara Chasin, titled Kerala State, India, Radical Reform and Development. Along with the lead article, it also carried 4 comments on Kerala. The authors were Maria Helena Moreira Alves, Carlos M. Villas, Prabhat Patnaik, and Samir Amin. I think it is fitting that at this conference, which coincides with the 25th year of this important contribution to the international radical literature on Kerala's development experience, we have 2 of these commentators who made perceptive observations on the path that Kerala had embarked upon. So my presentation is also in the spirit of these writings. My remarks or presentation, there is no slideshow. It is titled Emerging Challenges to Kerala's Development Strategy, Perspectives from a People-Centric Lens. Basically, I intend to make 4 comments or 4 points. The first is with regard to what we call the Kerala model. Now, these days we hear some scholars, not necessarily in economics, say, look, there is this problem in Kerala or that problem in Kerala. So there is no such thing called the Kerala model. So this seems to me to be the result of a confusion about the meaning of the term Kerala model. When we say Kerala model, it does not mean that Kerala is a model state in all respects. It simply means that it is not necessary for a region to wait till it becomes rich to bring about significant improvements in people's material conditions of living, distributed across the entire population, and that public action can be the driving force of such changes by forcing the governments to adopt redistributive measures and other programs. Defined thus, it could be seen that it can be replicated elsewhere also, and that in that sense, there is indeed something called the Kerala model. It does not mean that Kerala does not have problems. It has many, and there are a number of sections of society who have not benefited as much as the others from the gains that we have so far made. This might seem fairly obvious to many of us here, but we are living in times when it needs some reiteration, especially given the high cost of organizing seminars like these. Now, I believe the importance of public action is often ignored these days, and it requires particular emphasis. The advances that Kerala has made with regard to land reforms, the public distribution system, basic education and healthcare, all of these have been the result of powerful struggles led by the mass organizations of people. Land reform legislation, as is well known, was the result of long struggles by radical organizations of the peasantry and the agricultural workers, and its implementation was also the result of mass actions during the 1970s. The system of public distribution of food has its origins in peasant struggles for de-hoarding and food distribution during the 1940s, and subsequent demands to universalize the system. The spread of mass literacy, as distinct from the spread of education to a restricted set of people in conformation with the caste calling of the rulers, was also the result of demands that arose from mass organizations and popular governments' responses to those demands. The case of the provision of public health care facilities is also no different. Ensuring that such facilities work has also been a task that the mass organizations took upon themselves. A recurring example in the literature, for instance, is that doctors who regularly do not turn up in the primary health centers would be faced with protest actions at their doorstep, and that ensures that they do turn up. The institution of a wide range of social security benefits for various sections of workers in the state is a result of the fact that workers have organized themselves into trade unions and have waged struggles to gain many of these rights. Coming to the second point, many apprehensions were raised about this Kerala model, especially by the late 80s, early 90s and so on. And they centered around inadequate growth in output per capita in the basic commodity producing sectors, including agriculture, mainly agriculture and industry. And there was also the issue of high unemployment, which continues till date. The question was raised, is the Kerala model sustainable? Wouldn't the state run into fiscal difficulties and so on? And there are many who argued that the welfare-centric, redistribution-centric approach of the Kerala model itself is what is holding back economic growth in the state. Now, scholars sympathetic to the path that Kerala had chosen already stress the need for the transformation of production conditions in the state in a more radical direction. But in spite of many of these discussions in this regard, this historic task of the transformation of production conditions in the state was postponed, I would argue. In fact, this liberty was afforded to Kerala due to some new developments. Sreeraj has hinted at some of those. And those mainly were centered around the turnaround in the growth performance of the Kerala economy starting from the late 1980s. Now, how did this take place? This is a question that many scholars have tried to answer. And most arguments have focused on the increase in consumption demand as a result of increased remittances. Now, this argument can be critiqued, it has been critiqued. It can, of course, it can be nobody's case that remittances have not played a crucial role in driving economic growth in Kerala. It has. But did remittance-driven consumption lead to the upturn in growth that occurred in the late 1980s specifically? Because it was a period when remittances were, as per all available accounts, coming down in the context of the tensions and war in West Asia. My own ongoing research work has also been trying to answer this question. It would probably suffice, however, at this juncture, to say that an improvement in agriculture incomes, led by incomes from the natural rubber sector, played a leading role in this regard, in driving up mass demand, which led to a fillip in industrial growth as well. The growth in incomes from the rubber sector, in turn, was primarily the result of a steep increase in productivity during this period. Combined with rising prices and more areas coming under rubber cultivation, this meant that rubber came to account for an increasing proportion of incomes from agriculture. At its peak, rubber incomes accounted for almost half the agriculture incomes from proportion of incomes from agriculture in current prices. And a close look at the pattern of growth in manufacturing and in agriculture incomes, mainly rubber incomes, suggests a close relationship between changes in manufacturing growth and growth in rubber incomes. So you could see that when rubber incomes went up, manufacturing growth went up broadly, and when rubber incomes came down, manufacturing growth also came down. So broadly, this relationship between agriculture incomes and manufacturing growth was quite pronounced during the crash of prices of the perennial crops of Kerala during the second half of the 1990s. Subsequently, the prices picked up before slowing down once again. And it is likely that the relationship is not so close as earlier in the recent years, as the structural transformation in our economy has meant that fewer and fewer people depend on agriculture as the primary source of their income. This is also the subject of ongoing research. Now, remittances, as is well known, have continued going up during this entire period and have played a crucial role in keeping up consumption demand. However, as I said earlier, all this only meant that we managed to avoid facing the core problems of our economy head on. And I would argue that more recent developments have brought that task back onto the agenda. Which brings me to the third point, which is regarding the new challenges to Kerala's development strategy. The pivotal development in this regard is the worldwide economic crisis, which began in 2008 and which is still going on, and which has been showing no signs of abating as yet. Many observers have argued, including Prof. Patnaik, that capitalism is at a juncture where it has found no means to get out of the crisis. Now, the impact of the crisis has reached the shores of our country as well. If we relate it to the issues earlier mentioned, the crisis has immediate ramifications for the state economy as well. The collapse in the growth of world demand, declining oil prices and so on are likely to adversely impact remittances. It is true that the weakening of the rupee means a perverse windfall increase in remittances, but it is not clear for how long this can go on. And I suspect, like most others would do, that this is unlikely to be sustainable. The second aspect as you all would have guessed, is the collapse of incomes from the leading crop in Kerala, agriculture, rubber. So rubber prices have declined steeply. Even continuing production is so unremunerative these days that farmers have chosen not to tap trees, leading to an absolute decline in production. The power of the state government, at the same time, to protect the peasantry from price fluctuations is so limited by the constitutional division of powers between the state and the centre, which prevents the states from imposing any serious restriction on international trade. Setting up price stabilization funds to tide over the price crash is also beset with problems in a milieu of resource constraints and open borders. But the third important challenge is the rising inequality in Kerala. This is also something that Sreeraj here has worked upon. I wouldn't dwell on it too much. I'll just mention that as Sreeraj and Vamshi Vagulabharanam have pointed out in their work, inequality of consumption expenditure, which had declined between 1983 and 1993-94, has gone up steeply ever since. Inequality in Kerala is today significantly higher than the level of inequality at the All India level. Not only is this a challenge to the advances that Kerala have made in the sense of undermining a key feature of the development path that we are following, but increasing inequalities should be clearly seen as a threat to democracy itself, because it sets up a dynamic whereby the rising elite would use their enhanced class power to thwart redistributive policies that the people might demand in a democratic polity. Thus I come to my fourth and final point. If we want to preserve the gains that the people of Kerala have made with regard to human development, with regard to workers' rights, including the highest wage rates in the country in many sectors, social security, then we have to face the issue of transforming production conditions of our economy head on. I'll make 2 points in this regard. One, we need a renewed emphasis on the production of food crops, given the fact of the renewed deepening agrarian crisis and the acute difficulties of ensuring stable prices for cash crops. This is something that Professor Patnaik has talked about recently in the International Congress on Kerala Studies, where he argued that Kerala has to focus on ensuring food security, as denying the state food would be one of the means by which Kerala could be sought to be punished if it diverges from the neoliberal path of development. While agreeing with him, I reached the same suggestion from a slightly different angle. Second, increasing inequality is an immanent feature of capitalism, and corporate-led industrialization is only going to accentuate the worsening inequalities in Kerala. Nor will it alleviate unemployment in any substantial sense. Further, attracting big capital into the state can only be at the cost of suppressing wage growth. If we are to avoid that, the logical option would be a renewed emphasis and efforts to expand the public sector and the cooperative sector. So I would end by quoting from one of the lead article from a monthly review that I had talked about in the beginning. Without organized radical struggle, there is no genuine progress. This is the concluding remark that Richard Franke and Jason makes in their contribution. Coming from a university which faced an organized assault in the recent past, I can say this much: there are no safe havens. If we don't organize to defend what we have and to advance rights elsewhere, even the so-called safe havens will disappear. I'll stop here. Also because Siddiq has threatened public action against me if I take too long. Thank you.
I have two doubts. One is to Professor Heavy Chose. Our Dalits and tribes are always struggling, and their socio-economic status is very low. So how will you place these Dalits and tribes in the context of Kerala model development? And another one, that is about Muslim community women. Kerala, most of the Kerala people are religious. So, and in the context of this Kerala model development, religious is always restricting women's rights and their freedom. So, as a religious community, in the context of Kerala model development, what is the status of Kerala Muslim women? Thank you.
My question is to Professor George. From your presentation, I'm Geoffrey. From your presentation and the chair presentation yesterday. It made me think deeply on the issues. But I have three concerns. One is, why do the concerns of the 30s, or the concerns in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 90s, be the concerns of the 21st century? I normally follow, read the papers, or a series of strikes take place. But when you understand the concerns, they have a link with the documentation, with the history. With I get concerned. Why should that happen? Because the 21st century should be having new concerns. Then the second concern is about the public policy. I tend to think that I need to be corrected. You can come up with a public policy, like the issue of ST or the public food distribution or many other things. You can have a policy that addresses your concern at a tactical level, but not addressing the problem at a strategic point of view. But you can also have both. You can have an intervention that has a tactical and a strategic point of view. So I'm just asking, why do we see very many policies, but the policies coexisting with the concerns, then yet they are supposed to be addressing them? Finally, sorry to take much time, from your views and from the chair's views yesterday, and from the experience in Kerala, at least for the short time I have been, we have enough research centers, we have enough professionals, we have a society that is very civic. I mean, there is a potentiality, a lot of potentialities. But when you link the potentialities and the issues, the coexistence of some of especially on the social front, why should a certain problem coexist with the potential? Thank you very much.
One is to Jose. I'm Mridul Epan, Jose. For you asking who I am. So one is to you, which I think that's a very interesting idea of a fair wage. How does it look vis-a-vis? You need not answer it now, because I think it's a very basic thing, and I would like to have a discussion with you on this. Is it also a family wage? And how then do we look at a woman worker's wage? Should a woman worker's wage not be equal to a male worker's fair wage? That's one question I wanted to ask you. Because always in the context of the informal sector, we find that there is always this thing, that what the man gets is a family wage, so the woman need not actually get something which is equivalent to that. And the second thing is to Sreeraj. I mean, I think it's, of course, this whole increase in the rate of growth is really interesting in the case of Kerala, and you're attributing it to the determinants being a private growth in private consumption expenditure, and of course, you're saying investment is growing. Now, the thing is the investment growing in the usual hospital, schools type of category, or is the investment growing elsewhere also in the commodity producing sectors? So you might have done some disaggregation. I'd like to know that, because this is very crucial for what we are calling the future of Kerala. Where is investment really growing?
My question is to Professor Jose. So I'm very happy to listen to thought-provoking ideas, and it is very interesting that all those who visit government hospitals get health insurance. So recently I came to know that one doctor who is aspiring for MRCP failed in his qualifying exam The reason is he didn't suggest the person to the welfare department who will meticulously identify the deserving persons who requires health insurance card in our state. We know in Kerala, the BPL people are not getting their benefits and APL people are getting the benefits of BPL due to the interaction or the influence of the political parties or the persons. Then how we can meticulously identify the deserving people?
Is to Professor Jose. Sir, in your strategies towards the end of the presentation, in your strategies for the future, you have identified one point that beneficiaries should be made part of the administration. But we see that by the People's Plan campaign that we have for the last 10 progress, we see that wherever administration and participation go together, there is a chance of co-option. Now, the best example is the beneficiary committees that we have developed as part of the People's campaign, and we see that a lot of corruption is going on here. Now, is it not better that the beneficiaries remain separated from the administration and let them act as a vigilant group? So that's the first doubt. And next one to Sreeraj. Now, you mentioned about the India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement and the Indo-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, but what I understand is that by the Indo-Sri Lankan Free Trade Agreement, the only crop that is in the negative list is pepper. And the pepper prices is very high for the last 2-3 years. And it's not because of this agreement, it's only because of the pepper, the yield level that is happening, the reduction in yield in pepper because of root wilt disease, that the productivity is going down. So maybe the Indo-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, we have 2 or 3 crops which are affected, but the other thing, Indo-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, even coconut is not included there. Now, regarding the last presentation, you were mentioning about the power of public action in Kerala, but don't you think that it is coming down drastically? You were mentioning about the THC and the doctors, if the doctor is absent, people acting. I have, as part of a project on decentralization and health, I have visited around 20 PHCs, but what we see there is that now such a situation is now vanishing in Kerala, people coming together and acting against. Now, there is an adjustment between the Panchayat persons or the president and the PHC members that now this is not happening, any sort of public action is not happening, and you have side-by-side existence of all private hospitals. Now, that is going to be a very serious problem in Kerala. Now, I would like to invite your comment on that.
I just got one talk to Dr. E.P. Sreeraj. He mentioned about the transformation from mass-based consumption to elite-based consumption. First of all, I want to know what is this mass-based consumption and elite-based consumption, because you never defined these 2 terms in your presentation. Because as far as this consumption is not, did you define this particular terms on the basis of the consumption of the commodities that is being consumed? I mean, on the basis of the income levels of consumption or on the basis of the commodities? Second question is to Subin, who stated that Kerala model is a model and which could be replicated. But my question is that throughout the presentation of Professor E.V. Jose, one could understand clearly that Kerala model is clearly the product of a historical progression, a historical process that is highly unique to this climate, to this geography, a historical process that is highly unique to this climate, to this geography, to this space, to this time. So do you think that you can replicate all these phenomena in elsewhere?
My name is Pooja Raghu. I have 2 questions to Professor A.V. Jose. My first question is regarding fair wage. What is fair wage and what does it entitle? How do we define it and what are the disparities that could arise from it? And if it is feasible, what are the parameters or the criteria we could take into consideration? And the second question, parameters and what are the disparities that could arise from it? And the second question is regarding the Fiscal Responsibility Act. What does it entitle, and why and when was it implemented? Those are the questions. Thanks, sir.
Thank you for the extremely interesting set of questions. But you should also bear with me, I'm getting old, and when one is getting old, your hearing faculties tend to go the other way, and I'm not sure if I got all the questions right, but then I'll try to answer them. Coming to Subir's point about the Dalits and the women, what exactly, the kind of world of disabilities they live. My contention is, look at the situation 100 years ago. We have moved a long way. The kind of tremendous progress we made, mostly through affirmative action, envisaged in the Constitution. It certainly changed the tide. A lot of those people who were deprived for centuries have come to the fore, got a chance to sit on the table of brotherhood and claim through adult franchise, democratic voting rights, and they are treated as part of the society, and they have a say in the allocation of resources. And it's only by gaining access to improved educational facilities can these walls break down. All this talks about women being cornered and they're not able to articulate their rights and wishes certainly will change only when truly secular education gains ground. And that's inevitable. With all the efforts being made to impede the progress of a secular society, religious authorities will always be on the prowl, trying to impair it at every stage. But have faith. Education is a great level. Eventually, you and me will affirm our faith in the inevitability of a secular society which gives equal respect to all human beings. It might still be away, it might still be far away, but it's bound to happen in our lifetimes. So that's my answer to that question. We certainly have to live with these things, but certainly they are on the decline. And that's part of the transformation taking place in the society over a period of time. Coming to the answer from my friend Jeffrey from Africa, Nigeria, which country are you from, sir? Which country are you from? Rwanda. Okay, I'm sorry, I think we met each other before. Listen, we always think in terms of strategic interventions. Tactics are decided by the contemporary's reality. We deal with that. But then, a long view of history, that's where interventions, the strategic interventions come. And that kind of intervention is conditioned by the lessons of history. We know things move in a different direction, in a particular trajectory, conditioned by the historical forces. And therefore, these interventions, we might think that we are just responding to on the spur of the moment to a particular situation that came up, but 30s or 40s, as you mentioned, but then, over a period of time, the kind of societal forces bring about the kind of long-term changes. And it's that process of change we have got to accelerate. And even tactical interventions for the moment contribute to that long-term goal of bringing in a mature society where people come to the labor force and reap their returns in accordance with the effort they made, decided by the level of productivity, the productive contribution they make. And that's the kind of a long-term objective which all societies set. And what we are trying to say, creating institutional safeguards, is ensuring the stability of that society, essentially, by these institutional safeguards. Mridul, this point about fair wages, which also came elsewhere. The thing is, this notion, sometime back in the Indian Labour Congress, the Indian Labour Conference, where they decided the wages have got to be set in relation to subsistence wages. And this is an old notion. Any society which moves on to a higher standard of living ought to think in terms of a bigger basket of goods and services, a continuously expanding basket of goods and services which goes well beyond the calorie intensity considerations. We ought to take into new items into the basket, and these are all the legitimate rights of anyone who is there in the labor force. It has got to be a constantly redefined basket, and fair wages come close to that. It's in relation to the level of productivity people make. The productive forces of the entire society are going up, and therefore everyone has a right to take a share of the aggregate productivity of the nation, not distributed according to the skill content of people, which is already skewly distributed. No, here make sure that all members of the workforce, all participants of the workforce in the world of work, get a right to get fair wages, to keep the standard of living in consonance with that of a society with improved living standards. And fair wages come in there. It's certainly not subsistence wages wherein people compete for existence. I mean, it's a conceptually different. My point is, let's not try to. The point is, the moment we bring in what we need is bare survival. That's where we sort of recede into defining wages about daily wages, survival needs, and things like that. It's time a developed society, a society which is crossing the threshold of, let me say, moving on to an improved standards regime, certainly should be able to enhance the basket of goods and services offered to its citizens, and the state has an important role to play in making that possible. That was the message I tried to convey. My friend here about the APL, DPL categorization. My point is, let's get rid of these anachronistic calculations. Improve the quality and content of healthcare. Make it accessible to all. Some of us, many of them, may not be able to pay, but that should not be the kind of consideration that should stand in the way. Improve the overall delivery system. It's possible for the society to commandeer, accumulate wherewithal to improve the system. Make it possible for all people to take part in that. And that should be the objective. This categorization about those who can, those who cannot, I mean, that should not really come in the way. But it's much more important to go for something far more tangible. Puja and the beneficiary of the city's problems are let me come to that question. Beneficiaries and about the existence of corruption. But then we live with that. The only thing is, by creating improved safeguards with legislative backing, can these things be overcome? And the polity can come to create the kind of right legislative framework within which these institutions can function. And the problem of corruption will have to be dealt with separately. But then that should not be considered an obstacle to going in for making improvements in the system. And again, the question about Pooja, whose question about fair wages, I tried to answer. But Fiscal Responsibility Act was something which tried to put clamps on the state's spending power. I do agree, in a big state, in a big country like India, we ought to have that kind of restrictions, because our primary entity is at the state level, and therefore we are prone to misusing that facility to go in for unlimited spending. And prudential management of the economy certainly requires a certain amount of restrictions on the capacity to borrow and spend, but that should not prevent mobilizing resources with the intention of diverting them for social spending so as to improve the quality. And that's the kind of focus which we should aim at, not borrow or get money from wherever it is available, but then the internal tax resources of the state can certainly be mobilized to meet the rising social consumption requirements. That ought to be the objective, and there is a long way to go in that. Arya's point about women's participation. Look, let's face the fact, they are at the very rudimentary stages of development. It's a long question. I mean, it's a point I can go at length arguing about. But then let me say no, let me not go into that because Prabhat will get at it. Point is, we ought to make sure that they all come into the labor force, not necessarily as recipients of Jawaharlal Nehru National Guarantee Scheme. Certainly not. Into the labor force as skilled contributors. And that's the kind of system we have got to aim at. Skill development of all those people who are currently staying in the precincts of the household. And therefore one has got to work out new strategies aimed at that. I would even argue a point, which I did not raise here, that the entire amount of money we spend on rural employment creation program should be turned into stipendiary schemes. All those youngsters, all those young women who are in the precincts of the household, not willing to come out in the absence of available employment opportunities and not having the kind of required skills, should be given the stipend to go and acquire the skills. There are a whole variety of jobs now coming up. Traditionally used to be in the male domain, but one should make it possible for them to come and learn it, acquire it at the expense of the state. That's my point. And the entire amount of money we have been setting aside for them to give this kind of peanuts about their contribution to scrubbing the floor or removing the grass on the road, or what, that should not be the way we create employment. It should be about skilled jobs and training them to acquire the kind of those skills which can productively be utilized much later. And they all come into the labor force as productive partners ought to be the long-term target of the nation. Thank you. I'm sorry.
First, Dr. Ethan's question. See, in my paper, I clearly written that apart from the investment in agriculture sector and industrial sector, this household construction activities and business construction activities are also catapulting the aggregate demand. Okay. Now coming to Subin's argument that rubber sector is guiding the growth rate in India. In my presentation, I have shown that the small peasants' monthly per capita expenditure is declining over the year. So I don't know how he made that argument that rubber sector is stimulating the aggregate demand and causing the turnaround in growth in Kerala. Dr. Manju's question. See, there are a lot of econometric studies on how free trade agreement is causing widespread fluctuations in agriculture commodities prices. So, I think because of the free trade, all the commodities prices start fluctuating widely, and I can agree that these diseases are causing a lot of actually these type of diseases are imposing a lot of cost in the production side. But apart from this, the fluctuation in prices are making these peasants more vulnerable, and that is why we are seeing that this we are not able to export, our export on these agricultural commodities are declining over the years. Now, question on mass-based consumption. See, I argued this that in 1980s we had a mass-based consumption regime based on mass-based consumption, because almost all classes contributed substantially to the overall consumption expenditure. So in that way, it is mass-based consumption. And in the later part of, I mean, in 2019, we have seen that the elite class is contributing more to the total consumption expenditure. Its contribution is increasing over the years, and it is the class which contribute substantially to the overall consumption expenditure.
I agree actually. In fact, regarding this, I would like to quote Professor Ejaz Ahmed. It's one of my favorite remarks of his, that any rights that will last will be the rights we have fought for. So if the current generation believes that all these rights we have won will last forever, probably they'll be proven wrong. So if we just wait for some serious assaults to occur before we start organizing again and starting to take these things seriously, then we'll be up for a shock. Second, with regard to the Kerala model, whether it is replicable or not. Now, a model is an abstraction. It is not a description. Okay, so of course, the path that Kerala has followed is a unique path, just like any other region. So if you look at its details, it will be different with regard to any region. But if you separate out the essential features of it, so that is why it becomes a model. You look at any decent microeconomics textbook, and it will describe what a model is. So once you separate out those essential features, it will become an abstraction. So in that sense, Kerala model is replicable. The fact that it is possible to bring about tangible improvements in the material conditions of living of people, especially with regard to human development and so on. And and you don't have to wait till that region, having a very high per capita income and so on. And the fact that public action, that is action, or people getting organized to win these rights through the actions of mass organizations. So this is what is captured by the term public action. Public action can be the driving force of these changes. So that is what the Kerala model is all about. And this can be replicated. Now, of course, this can be proven only in action. So that is there. There will be specificities and differences and so on wherever you go, but the essential features will remain. I have got a written question, so I'll read it out. There is a witty comment on the fourth estate circles that a positive spin-off of globalization is it reduced air pollution since lots of small-scale industries were forced to close down. Consequently, a number of employees were thrown out of employment, and there begins the collapse of Kerala's development strategy. Your comments. Now, I would say that the kind of Kerala development strategy that we are talking about is at loggerheads with the policies of globalization. So the problem clearly, as per your comment, is with regard to the policies of globalization, not with regard to at least the kind of development strategy that we are advocating. With regard to Sreeraj's comment, I have to make a brief comment. I didn't say that rubber incomes are guiding Kerala's growth throughout. I made a very specific remark that in the late 80s, there was a growth turnaround for the Kerala economy, and that had a lot to do with the improvement in incomes originating in the natural rubber sector. And if you take a close look at manufacturing growth and rubber income growth, for about 1.5 decades, you'll find a very close relationship. Now I can demonstrate, but that will be a separate presentation altogether. And I suspect, I mentioned that, I suspect that in the recent years, this close relationship would have declined because there is a structural transformation in the economy and possibly the kind of changes that you are also talking about. But you'll have to disaggregate and see what the issues are.
Thank you very much. Having asked everybody else to remain quiet or to cut down on their presentations, it would be too much if I take time. That would be unfair. But I cannot help making just one statistical point. I made a calculation. Any of you can do that. You're welcome to do it. Between 2004-5 and 2011-12, I calculated the per capita growth rates in several states in India. These days there's much talk about the Gujarat model, so I calculated the per capita growth rate in Gujarat. That was about 7.1% per annum. I calculated the per capita growth rate in Kerala, and it was about the same. So that this whole business, but on the other hand, in terms of human development indices, Kerala was high in the beginning and continues to remain high at the end. Gujarat, on the other hand, is very low in the beginning and if possible even lower towards the end, because much of their fiscal resources went in providing incentives of all kinds to attract capital into the state, with which they succeeded in attracting capital, and that gave rise to a high growth rate, but at the cost of welfare expenditures. In Kerala's case, you got virtually the same growth rate as Gujarat, but by spending more on welfare and not spending resources on capital, on attracting capital into the state. Now, in a sense, my definition of the Kerala model would be the pursuit of a strategy of the second kind as opposed to the first. And incidentally, for some reason, fiscal responsibility came up. Kerala passed a legislation which reduced fiscal deficit as a percentage of GSDP to 2%, while even the centre had a legislation keeping it to within 3%. So that I don't know why, who advised it, and the government passed a legislation which I consider an absurd one. Fortunately, Dr. Thomas Isaac did not pay any attention to this legislation when he was the finance minister, which is why expenditures by the state on a number of welfare schemes could be revived in the period I'm talking about in Kerala, like the high growth rate. I'd just like you to do this calculation and think for yourself.
To propose a vote of thanks, may I invite Vijay Sri.
Good morning all. The technical session 1 has in fact marked the beginning of a heated intellectual discourse which will be flamed in the following sessions. And on this note, I would like to thank Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who has been the honorary chair for this session, for his valuable presence and for spending his gracious time with us. And again, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor A.V. Jose. And he has beautifully given the tradition of development experience which we have had. It was not a mere presentation, it was actually a beautiful narration which is given. And also I would like to thank the presenters of the day, Dr. A.P. Sreeraj and Mr. Subin for their valuable time. And finally, I would like to thank all the audience for their warm responses and their active involvement. Thank you all.